So today we're going to be going over our youth flexibility guidelines. So this is going to be the first part of us diving into OPT templates, right? So if we're talking about, this is sort of the chart that we usually use to like write our clients' workouts and stuff, right? We're going to start with this, after we've gathered our assessment section, we're going to start by working our way through a warm-up into sort of a movement prep, any SAQ work that they happen to want to do, and then we dive into sort of the meat and potatoes of our workout. So today, we're going to be going over the flexibility portion, which is pretty much the first half and the last half of the warm-up / cool down period. So we'll definitely spend a little bit of time talking about warm-ups and cool downs, and then we'll, work our way through all the materials and stuff. It'll be a little bit less in the PowerPoints, a little bit more free form, because we'll kind of be off the page, sort of writing workouts instead. Or looking at examples of writing workouts. So let's dive right in. Yeah, so flexibility training, right? Obviously a pretty critical part of all program design. It's where we address the overactive part of the overactive, underactive conversation. You guys should remember from Friday, we were talking about like why we do the overhead squat, right? The overhead squat tells us if you have an excessive forward lean, you could have overactive gastrocnemius muscles, right? So then I, as the trainer, know that I need to write in your program static gastrocnemius stretch, right? For the appropriate amount of like time and the appropriate duration, the appropriate number of reps and all of that stuff. And if you do all that, then it should have a positive effect on your mobility. It should result in that excessive forward lean going away. So that's really what we're going to kind of be going over today. So we're going to be looking at the rationale behind like youth flexibility training, like why it's important, kind of for the reasons I just said. We're going to talk about general exercise guidelines, so like how to implement them. And we'll talk about our flexibility options. For youth, those options are going to be a little bit limited. But remember, this is an overall program design class, so there are times where I will be jumping out of the PowerPoint, doing some notes that are for the standard test prep version of things. So looking at flexibility training, right? We do know that like youths are growing very quickly, during their like as they are younger, like they're experiencing like growth spurts and stuff. And so that is going to have pretty big implications in regards to like our overall like flexibility, right? And so flexibility training is a really important thing to incorporate into like a youth program, because we want to maintain that flexibility as long as possible, right? And when I talk about flexibility, what am I necessarily like referring to? Well, by definition, we're going to refer to flexibility as the ability to move a joint through its complete range of motion, right? So that being able to move through a complete range of motion, like if I, let's say I need to do like a rowing motion, right? And I'm, I've got like a cable or, something, and I'm rowing it this way, and then my shoulders elevate like this, right? Because I'm getting this like weird, scapular like elevation and like a forward tilt, right? Like if that starts to happen during my rowing motions naturally, then it shows that like I've got certain joint restrictions inside of like my shoulder joint. So what's happening is I don't have proper scapular mobility, and I don't have proper like shoulder mobility, which are two separate joints that we'll talk more about next mod. But those two joints are working in conjunction together, and like they're not facilitating movement through the full range of motion. Instead, what happens is they start to get, a pretty good chunk of the way through the range of motion, and then they alter their course to move in a different way, right? The same thing is true, again, like we look at like an excessive forward lean, right? So excessive forward lean, let's see here, calf muscles. Actually, that's not right. Let's say limited dorsiflexion. So, if we remember that, like, we've got our dorsiflexion, which is pulling our toes towards us, and we've got our plantar flexion, which is pointing our toes away, right? So there we go, right? Dorsiflexion, pull it up this way, plantar flexion, pull it this way. If we have a limited dorsiflexion, right? If we have a limited ability to bring our toes towards us or bring our tibia towards our toes, right? Either way, we're going to create that sort of steep angle here, right? If we have a limited ability to do that, it's going to be very difficult for us to squat down. And instead, what we'll see is we'll see somebody squat like this. I mean, look at the angle here. If I just, I'm going to, let's see here. Let's go like that and open up Paint. And then I just need this part. Copy. Oh, okay. So if we take a look at this guy, right, and then just for my own OCD, that's going to draw an old version. Totally doesn't matter, but I need to do that. All right, if we take a look at this guy, right, we see where he is excessively leaning forward. If we take and we draw a line, right, if we were to draw a line looking at the angle here, right, so there's his toes to his ankle, and then here is his ankle coming out his knee, right? So that's a pretty steep angle there, right? Versus like if we go like this, right, and then we go up here like that, right? That doesn't look like a huge difference between the two, but if you were to measure this angle here, I mean, like these things side by side, it's a pretty big difference. Like let's bring these just a little bit closer to each other. Let's just look at the angles alone, right? You can see like this is much flatter compared with the other version, right? So what that's doing is that's causing him to have to lean forward. He has to lean forward because he doesn't have as much angle here, right? So you can just kind of see that, right? Like if we view it from the side and we see someone like excessively leaning forward, right? He's also got like a massive, we can see like, his shins are coming up this way and like his low back's coming this way. This is sort of an ideal squat, right? Like the angle here and the angle here are actually parallel to each other. And that's what we look for. We look for a parallel angle from shoulder to hip and from knee to ankle. This knee to ankle, and then this is crossing over with the upper body. That's how we know it's excessive. And it's happening because of that limited, angle that we see in the ankle complex. And so that's what we call limited dorsiflexion. So if we can see that in our clients, we want to address it as best we can, right? Look, you can see a million other, this is actually more intense than the other one, right? This is funny. They're showing the angle here, but look at the angle of his shins, right? And you can actually see like, this is a better squat for sure. But even then you can kind of tell his heels are actually popping up just a little bit. So this guy actually kind of, chances are he made this article or whatever it is he's working on because this is something that you can see he's struggling a little bit with. I think that everyone has a little bit limited ankle dorsiflexion. This is pretty just common amongst most of our clients. Stretching out your calves is pretty much something that applies to everyone working on like ankle stiffness. So that's what we're talking about, right? The ability to move that through its full range of motion. Within the ankle, that means that our squat gets messed up. In our shoulders, it means that our rows get messed up or our presses get messed up. In our spine, it means that like lumbar flexion and extension get messed up, right? And so this starts to have pretty big ramifications on our overall posture. So our job with a proper flexibility training program, right, is to ensure we develop proper movement patterns. So by learning how to dorsiflex the ankle effectively, your body is going to get more comfortable sitting into that range of motion. We want to reinforce those good habits and move the body the way it's supposed to move, and again, get the body used to those habits. We want to maintain a full range of motion for all of our joints. We want to be able to move our joints through the range that they really are designed to be able to move around, right? Remember, all your joints like have for the most part, the same angles and shapes and concavities as everyone else. But when your muscles get really tight, it compacts those things in the joints, and then there's less space in the joints, right? We actually see that all the time when you see somebody who just has like low back stiffness. They have a bad time. They have a hard time like moving their lumbar spine. If we take a look at that, right? Let's look at limited disc space spine. So you can see here, right, like this is what a normal healthy disc is supposed to look like. But here we can see the disc actually has, you know, less space in between these little joints right here. That's going to lead to mobility issues, right? And you can see where it starts to also, you can see this is where we have like a degenerative disc, where like these little like knobby bits on the bone are starting to flare out. That's because okay, and there's a herniated disc. So this is where I think they're actually just showing. Oh, okay, yeah, this is like I was like, it's this poor person, like their whole spine. You can see all the different versions of like, here's a normal disc up here. Here's a slightly degenerated one. Here's one that's bulging. They did some type of excessive range of motion, and then that caused the materials within the discs to start bulging against. That can cause like a touch on the nerve. And then if it tears, that releases all this material called the nuclear pulsus. That starts leaking out and touching the nerves as well. So that's a herniated disc. Herniation means a tear in the lining of something. A thinning disc here. And then we see like full degeneration here. So you see these like little knobs that we're starting to see on the spine. Those knobs are basically where, because the discs were so thin, the spine started like bumping into each other. And then your immune system was like, holy crap, we got a major fracture in the spine. And so then it like sends, you know, new bone tissue to the area, which kind of actually doesn't really help. Well, I mean, it does. It ends up making way too much bone tissue. Kind of like, I don't know if anybody in here has ever like broken a bone and then they can feel like me, like I've actually broken I've broken like 14 bones. But one of them was on the side of my hand. And I can actually feel where I have extra like bone tissue because of that fracture. Because basically like what your body does is it just kind of, it's almost like duct taping, right? It just puts layers and layers and layers over it. So this is an immune response that causes like these sort of bone spurs and things like that. So anyway, that is limited range of motion. That means this person's gonna have a pretty, I mean, this person especially, but like, you know, someone with thinning discs, they're gonna have limited range of motion, and they're gonna have a stiff lower back, right? So you can kind of see that. That's a spinal fusion actually, but like you can see there's no space there and lots of space here. That's not good. And then they gave them they fused their spine together to make like their own little version, and hey, now there's space between there. So anyway, that is why flexibility is so important, right? We need to make sure that we maintain the space between our joints. By the way, this is also why women tend to be a little bit more flexible than men are. They actually have more space between their joints, which is great because that leads to like deeper ranges of motion. But sometimes it can actually lead to also deeper levels of arthritis, particularly rheumatoid arthritis. There's sort of a little bit more space between the joints. Therefore, there's a little bit more of a breeding ground for that autoimmune disease. So very important for maintaining full range of motion. It also reduces our risk of injury. If you're able to move through that full range of motion, guess what? That's how your body's designed to move. So if you are able to do that, your injury risk is gonna be much, much lower, you know? And then it's gonna improve your sports performance. Like the more flexible you are, you know, the better you are at moving through a full range of motion, the more effective you are gonna be at like a specific sport. And I know that there's somewhat of a counter argument to this, because one thing that we have seen is that with increased flexibility comes decreased tension. Like if you imagine like a muscle that can move through a range of motion like this versus a muscle that can move through a range of motion only like this, right? But they're both tied end to end. The one that has less range of motion is going to be stiffer, and it's actually going to have more of like tension. It's going to have more tension in it, which is going to mean it's more explosive. This is where you guys have heard this before, I'm sure, where they tell you not to do like slow stretching before you try to go do like something explosive. And it's because like if you are like fully lengthening things out, you're losing some of the tension in those muscles. And I know that like the tension within our muscles is also a way for us to like improve our sports performance, because that means you can be more explosive and jump higher and faster, whatever. But the thing is, if you can't move through a full range of motion, it doesn't matter how much tension is in your muscle. You're not going to be athletic anyways. You know, if you can't move through a full range of motion, you're not going to be able to like have proper mechanics. You're going to lose a lot more tension that way. So the whole argument that you should avoid stretching if you are like an explosive athlete honestly falls apart pretty quickly if you actually think more about it. But you'll hear people say that argument all the time. You'll hear it in the realm of, you know, your clients will bring it up because they'll read an article online or something, and they'll say like, hey, shouldn't I not do like these stretches because it makes me less explosive and we're doing box jumps today? And it's like, love where your head's at, like glad you know, are studying on your own. However, you know, we're going to get more range of motion out of your body by getting you into like a proper mobility pattern. And with that deeper range of motion, you're going to be more explosive than you would be if, you know, and yeah, we're going to lose a little bit, right? But it's like gaining 10 to lose 2 instead of like preserving the 2 and gaining nothing, you know? It's just not, it's a much better investment. So, that is sort of talking about poor flexibility, right? So here's a couple examples of what we see here. And this is going to be what we refer to as relative flexibility, but we can see like poor flexibility, right? So let's say someone's squatting and they don't have very good range of motion in their foot and ankle complex. So what starts to happen is their feet are going to externally rotate rather than their shin traveling forward, you know, like we mentioned, right, and having a deep angle. What instead happens is they start to feel a little bit tight and their body naturally turns their feet away into external rotation. And that takes the stretch off of the gastrocnemius. That actually stretches out ever so slightly on the medial side and allows the lateral side to stay in a shortened position. And the lateral side is usually the one that's very tight in most of our clients, especially and definitely true in our clients of feet turner outers, right? If we look at like what muscles are overactive on a foot turn out, you know, we will see the lateral gastrocnemius, right? I have a bigger picture than that. So feet turn out, that's going to be an overactive soleus, lateral gastrocnemius, and then we're also going to see the biceps femoris short head, which is a tight hamstring muscle in the back of the knee. When that happens, that's poor motor control. Their brain and their body is not able to sort of sync to control the joint the way they are supposed to. It's going to lead to poor technique, which means that certain muscles are being overstressed while other muscles are not being stressed enough. And, you know, it could be that our client just doesn't fully understand how to do the movement properly. So we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to, like, you know, fix this problem. An example of what we just talked about, right? When your feet turn out like that, that is like you finding a way to get the job done, but it's not necessarily how we intended the job to get done. So we have a term for that, and we call that relative flexibility, okay? So relative flexibility is the body finding the path of least resistance during a functional movement, right? So the body finds a way to get the job done, even if your body's not designed to move that way. So if I were to, you know, try and squat, right? Like, let's say I'm just doing like regular old body weight squats and like, you know, I've got those really tight calves, right? I'm in a group exercise class. I'm trying to keep up with everybody else in the class, right? They're like, do your squats, right? And I'm trying to like watch with everybody and, you know, be part of the class. And I'm squatting like this, right? I'm just dropping my chest down like crazy. I'm doing more of a hinge than anything, right? But in my brain, I think I'm doing it right? Like I'm watching everybody in the class and I'm like, you know, I'm doing a little hip bend, I'm doing a little knee bend, right? My eye line's going low, which I'm assuming everybody else is experiencing, right? Like I think I'm squatting properly, right? But the thing is, you know, trainer from the front of the room, they're watching, they see me back there, like dropping my head down and stuff. And, you know, hopefully they're going to come over and say, keep your chest up, you know, try to sit yourself back into that squat. And if you have a trouble with that full range of motion, let me know. And so then all of a sudden I try to make an adjustment. I try to keep my chest up. but I feel like I'm falling backwards, right? And again, trainer sees that. It's like, great. And they come over, they give me a little bit of help. They elevate my heels, right? They put a couple plates under my heels. And now suddenly, with that slight elevation, I'm able to stay much more upright as I squat down. I got more of a upright chest angle, right? So they allowed me to remove the flexibility here. But the problem is that got me through my group exercise class. That did not have a positive effect on my body overall. Like that didn't change anything in my body, right? We didn't improve my mobility at all. So what needs to happen is outside of that class, I need to get from a place of relative flexibility, which is me moving in my version of a squat, right? Because what I was doing right there, that wasn't a squat, right? It was something that looked kind of like a squat, it was close. But it's relative to me. It's not an actual like squat in the way that it's like intended and designed, and it's not working in the way that our body is sort of designed to move, right? So I'm kind of flexible, well, not really, right? It's like I'm flexible relative to the limited mobility that I have. So that's going to lead to poor motor control. That's going to reinforce bad habits. I'm going to learn how to do that squat improperly, and then my brain's going to hold on to that information, and it's going to try to do that more often, right? There's a lot of problems with that. So outside of that class, I need to do lots of calf stretches, loosen up my gastrocnemius, loosen up my soleus, get to a full range of motion, and get from a place of relative flexibility to actualize real flexibility, I totally do this. I mean, everything here that everybody does this. Like you are doing this constantly without realizing it, right? That's what relative flexibility is. This is the exaggerated version of relative flexibility that I always tell people, where it's like, hey, we're gonna do a hamstring stretch. Everybody touch your toes. Like if I go like this, I'm totally touching my toes right now, right? Absolutely. But like, am I stretching my hamstrings right now? No, I'm just performing a lot of like spinal flexion, right? Like this does not affect my hamstrings, like, right? And so you might say that you completed the movement, right? But not really. You weren't flexible. You were relatively flexible. And those really are not the same thing. So we want to teach our clients like how to get that full range of motion. This is why flexibility training is so important. So, when we identify poor flexibility, right? When we identify this during the overhead squat, during the single leg squat, during a pushing assessment, during a pulling assessment, whatever assessment we happen to do with our clients, right? First thing we want to do is we want to identify the reason for that flexibility. So you want to run through your little mental Rolodex and go, okay, they move like this, therefore this is what's tight, right? How do you know what that is? Here's your list, right? Like this is the list that's in your book. If your client's feet turn out, like I said, it's going to be the outside calf muscle, right? The lateral gastrocnemius, or maybe it's the biceps femoris. Maybe it's that little short hamstring muscle that I passionately hate. Or maybe we have a bad relationship, the biceps femoris and I. Or maybe it's your soleus, right? This little tight muscle in the back of your calf. What if your client's knees are caving inward? Maybe it's tight adductors. Maybe it's the biceps femoris again, or the TFL, right? Any of these muscles on the probable overactive list. Now, why is it the overactive list? Like, why do we know that that's sort of causing our limited range of motion? Because an overactive muscle, by definition, is a muscle that will not relax, at least not when it's supposed to. It's a muscle that stays contracted even though you're telling it to relax, right? So let's look at my biceps and triceps, right? Because they are sort of antagonists to each other. So I've got my bicep here, which performs elbow flexion, and I've got my tricep here, which performs elbow extension, right? So this, when it contracts, this muscle has to relax. And when this muscle contracts, this muscle has to relax, right? That's a normal, healthy relationship of those two muscles, right? It's kind of like a pulley, right? It's like when this one pulls, this one lets go, right? And it looks something kind of like this. At least that's how it's supposed to look. But what if we get a muscle that just through our own daily movement patterns. Maybe we sit in a chair all the time, so we get used to being in hip flexion, right? Our muscle kind of gets used to this new resting position where it's much shorter and much tighter. Well, then we're going to start to run into problems, because that means that muscle is not going to relax when it's supposed to, and that's going to lead to relative flexibility, right? So what happens, what happens in, let's look at the, what's my favorite example? I don't know. They all work really well, but let's go with knees cave in. That one's an easy one. No, actually, let's look at excessive forward lean. So let's look at excessive forward lean here. We know that like the muscles that cause an excessive forward lean, right? That's going to be the soleus and the gastrocnemius, right? So those are our probable overactive muscles, right? So generally with an excessive forward lean, right, these muscles are so tight that they're causing your person to lean forward. And then this muscle, the anterior tibialis, which is exactly on the opposite side of the joint, that muscle is just not able to contract. It's not able to do what it's supposed to do. So this muscle needs to be turned on while these muscles need to be turned off. And if we're able to do that, we are able to restore a full range of motion. So that's what we call a muscle imbalance, right? God dang it. I gotta get used to this new keyboard. My typing has gotten way worse. That's not the picture I'm looking for. There we go. So what we're seeing is a joint that might be pulled into the wrong range of motion. There's our underactive muscle, which is in a fully stretched position. And there's our short, really tight muscle that's in a full contracted position. And that's not what we want, right? Like that's what's going to lead to that limited range of motion. It's going to screw up, that's going to mess up with our joint balance, right? There we go. That's even better, right? There's a normal joint and there's a dysfunctional muscle imbalance. So, what happens is antagonist muscles to the tight muscle, they can't contract, which is not great. And then what also happens is like, because that main opposite muscle of whatever muscle is really tight can't do what it's supposed to do, now another muscle has to kind of step in to try to do the job for that inhibited muscle, right? So let's go back to, we've got the agonist, antagonist, and we've got the synergist muscles, right? So if we think of the agonist as Batman, we think of the antagonist as the Joker, and we think of the synergist as Robin, right? So like you've got Robin there assisting Batman. He's supposed to help out. But if the Joker's got Batman tied up and he can't do anything, then Robin has to do all of the work. And he's not designed to do all the work. So what ends up happening is that muscle gets overdeveloped and now it becomes overactive, and that can have further effects on the kinetic chain. And that can further decrease your range of motion and further mess up your posture, right? Not to mention that little tiny muscle is not really designed to do most of the heavy lifting. It's not designed to do this movement. The agonist muscle was designed to do this movement. So chances are that synergist is more likely at risk for getting injured because it is more likely to snap or break or something. So this is why poor flexibility is so important. So we want to first identify the reason, right? We identify the reason by kind of working off of this chart here, or up here. This chart that exists up here is how I should say it, right? That's going to be in everyone's brains by the time you graduate. We want to remain patient when we're working, especially with youth clients, right? Like stretching is not as fun as running around a field. It's not as fun as playing, running through a speed ladder, or doing fun mobility drills or whatever, right? So we got to remain patient. It's oftentimes like your youth clients are the ones who don't do their flexibility homework. Now, that being said, I know plenty of freaking adults who also don't do their flexibility homework a lot and don't do their stretches the way they're supposed to, even though it is vitally important. I'm one of those adults, by the way. It's tough sometimes when you're like, this is just not as fun as like lifting weights. So we got to make sure we remain patient. Make sure you coach the proper movement. Try to encourage your clients how to do it. the way they're supposed to. Now, if your client cannot move through a full range of motion the way they are supposed to, then you can regress that exercise appropriately, right? So for instance, like a regression for the version of, if somebody's leaning forward, like during the squat, you can elevate their heels, right? It should be noted, like I said, that is not fixing the problem. That's just getting me through the workout. Now I can use my glutes. Now I can exercise a little bit while being in this position, so I can start to get the benefits of calorie burns and recruiting my glute muscles and stuff like that. I can get those benefits without even seeing overall improvement. But if I want to improve this person as an athlete overall, I need to address the root source of the problem, because we can't just put a Band-Aid on it every single day and elevate the heels, right? We want to solve the problem. And that is where corrective exercise comes in. Corrective exercise is where we are going to work on increasing the range of motion of our overactive muscles and increasing the activity in our underactive muscles, right? Because that's the other thing we're not really spending too much time talking about today, unfortunately, is what about this other side of the list right here? What about our probable underactive muscles? What do we do about them? Unfortunately, if you only untie one side of the knot and you don't pull that joint back in the other direction, it's not going to improve your range of motion either, right? So not only do I need to stretch my overactive stuff, I also need to activate my underactive stuff. And that's actually where you're going to see NASA. This is something Mo's going to teach you guys. Not that we don't talk about it here in the core, obviously, because we're talking about it right now, but you're going to learn the corrective exercise continuum. Which is going to look exactly like this, right? So basically it's this this little 4-step process, right? And it's a 4-step process where you start by inhibiting overactive muscles. So you get those overactive muscles to turn off. Then once they're turned off, we're going to lengthen those overactive muscles by, stretching them out through a full range of motion. So you can teach your brain, hey, this is how long the muscle's supposed to be. Then we're going to activate those underactive muscles on the opposite side of the joint. So we're going to activate those, get those muscles woken up, right? We put the overactive stuff to sleep. We wake up the underactive stuff. Then we're going to teach that stuff that's finally awake how to kind of work with the rest of the body. And that's where we integrate it with a total body movement. So there's a picture up here that I just saw that was actually really good. So here we can see somebody who has oh man, see, yeah, this is dumb. I thought this was going to be an example of going all the way through it. All right, let's say this person, all right, this should not be a hamstring foam roll right now. What they should be doing is foam rolling their hip flexor, right? So let's say they have an overactive hip flexor and an underactive glute, right? So they have an excessive, that could also be caused by an excessive forward lean, actually. But let's say they have a low back arch, right? Hip flexors are tight, glutes are weak. So what you would do is you would foam roll the hip flexors, which would be up here. Then you would stretch those hip flexors like this. Then you would activate the glutes. So go straight to from the hip flexor over to the other side of the joint onto the glutes, right? And then you would integrate the glutes with a full body movement. So this person's doing a ball squat, bicep curl to dumbbell shoulder press, right? So it's a 3-part movement: squat, curl, press. So now their glutes are learning how to work while their brain's focused on a lot of other stuff as well. So that's sort of the 4-step process that Mo's going to drill with you guys when you get to capstone. But it's something we should all consider all the time, as trainers who are looking at improving someone's mobility, right? I want to address their muscle balances. I want to stretch out the overactive stuff, and I want to strengthen the underactive stuff. Any questions on that so far, guys? Andres, Dalen, Cody, you guys feeling good?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So let's take a look at chat bubble. All right, let's take a look at like I said, our general guidelines for flexibility training, right? How are we going to do this, implement this into an overall routine? Well, first off, you want to make sure that you are encouraging practice of flexibility every day. You should be doing some version of stretching every day. One of the healthiest things you can do, I go on kicks with this is just stretching before you go to bed. It's great. It leads to more relaxed sleep, deeper sleep. It's got a million benefits, as long as you are not like doing these stretches where you're like, come on, just reach, right? Because then all of a sudden you're creating all this tension and then you're gonna be laying in bed like, fully awake. That's not awesome. So practice your flexibility daily. There's some new interesting research out there that is suggesting like static stretches. I mean, static stretches are good at improving range of motion. We've always known that, but they're finding that like multiple repetitions of static stretches have been shown to be a little bit more effective than like super long duration static stretches. So there's sort of two ways to do static stretch. I mean, static stretches are big, long, they're kind of what we think of when we think of stretches, right? The big, long 30-second holds, right? They're finding that like 2 sets of 30 seconds is more effective than just a straight 60 seconds. And there's some people who will hold their stretches for up to 4 minutes. There's actually a whole specific branch of yoga based around 4-minute holds, 4-minute poses. And that's a very like long duration. That's definitely going to lead to some improvements in mobility. But in terms of like long-term changes, one of the things that I've been looking at that I really like a lot lately is like 2 sets of like a full 30 seconds. And that is a really great way to improve and that range of motion and inhibit those overactive muscles. So encourage flexibility training daily. Always, always, always warm up and cool down. This is a great place. We definitely want to do this at the top of our workout. Not only does warming up have benefits in terms of like raising core temperature and tissue temperature, which is going to further improve range of motion and further improve performance. Not only is it important for like, helping your youths regulate temperature controls, because remember, they are bad at temperature control. It's also obviously the first thing you want to do before you go do physical activity, right? Like you want to be stretched out before you try to move a muscle through the full range of motion. Why would you do your first set of something or try to move through the full range of motion of something before you can actually move through the full range of motion of something, right? Turn your calves off before you get onto the gym floor if you're an excessive leaner, or if you're a foot turnouter. Like you got to address those things beforehand so that you have proper range of motion once you get into the gym. I'm sure, you guys have experienced this with me, like in a couple times that like we've gone to the park and we've met together, right? And we do a little bit of flexibility training, and then you go through these, you're like, oh man, I feel like I can move easier, right? Like that's exactly what we're going for. So always, always, always apply that. And then the terms that we're going to be mainly looking at, we've got sort of 3 main categories, 3 ways that we apply flexibility training. So we've got corrective flexibility training, active flexibility training, and functional flexibility training. And they all sort of benefit from different physiologic processes. So corrective flexibility and functional flexibility are the 2 that are going to be mentioned in this PowerPoint. Those are the versions that like we want to work through with our youth clients because youths aren't super great at active flexibility. And we'll talk about why here in just a minute. But remember, my job is to get you guys prepped for the overall like NASM test. You're going to notice that I do put active flexibility here in your notes, and you may even have homework questions that are related to active flexibility in your homework, even though the youth class is primarily asking, like I said, corrective and functional. It sort of skips through like level 2. So what is corrective flexibility, right? Well, by definition, corrective flexibility is the flexibility training that is designed to improve your joint range of motion and improve your muscle imbalances. So this is in particular the type of flexibility that we want to use if we are trying to improve our client's posture, right? It's correcting any dysfunction that they happen to have. So what corrective flexibility means in terms of the OPT template, right? If we look at the OPT model, not template, we have got our 3 levels and our 5 phases, right? So we've got level 1, level 2, and level 3. That consists of phase 1, phase 2, 3, 4, and phase 5. So phase 1 corresponds with level 1. Phases 2, 3, and 4 correspond with level 2. Phase 5 corresponds with 3. If our client is in the stabilization level, so if they're anywhere within level 1, which honestly the only place they can be is phase 1, so that's easy. If they're anywhere within level 1, we are going to apply corrective flexibility. And corrective flexibility is where you write a flexibility program that consists of 2 major tools: self-myofascial release, which is foam rolling, and static stretches. So self-myofascial release, right? Working on like a foam roller, or even like, like Andres, you're the massage guy, right? Like even if you're doing just like, if you're like working on yourself and doing like a little bit of like maybe self massage, that's self-myofascial release, right? You don't have to use a foam roller. There's a million other tools out there. When you go to a massage therapist, you're getting assisted myofascial release, right? That's someone else doing your myofascial release for you, right? So when we say that, right, there's a lot of different tools. There's SMR tools. Let's see if this pulls up a picture. Like, we'll see if this gets, perfect. So there's a lot of them out there, right? There's foam rollers of different variants. There's things called tiger tails. These are really interesting. These like sticks that, allow you to kind of roll a little bit. There's even better. You can see like here's like a knob one that can go on either side of your upper back between your shoulder blades, right? There's the like regular old lacrosse ball. Like, I keep this one right here for whenever I'm working on the computer too long. I can just press this into my low back and be like, God, I gotta get up, I gotta move, right? So lacrosse balls are great. All these are really, really interesting tools, right? This is one that allows you to kind of roll your back without having to worry about like rolling over your spine, which by the way, you should never do. So all these little tools here, and there's a lot of really weird shaped ones too. These are all like myofascial release tools, right? They're designed to, alleviate trigger points and smooth out your muscles, right? So the way that works, right, is we apply through self-myofascial. We're going to apply gentle pressure to a Golgi tendon organ. And you guys will remember, we talked about Golgi tendon organs when we mentioned our muscles, right? They're the sensory receptors that run through the entire length of our muscle. And their job is to sense the length of that muscle and the rate of that length change, right? And so, I'm sorry, I totally just described a muscle spindle. Sorry. Golgi tendon organs, I forgot what we were talking about here. Golgi tendon organs are the ones that live at the tendons, right? They're the ones that are actually near the insertion points, right? They're the ones that sense the tension within a muscle and the rate of that tension change. So when you hear tendon, think tension. That's what a GTO is. So a Golgi tendon organ, right? What we're going to do is we're going to apply gentle pressure to that Golgi tendon organ. Okay. So that means that like when you're placing your foam roller, by the way, it should be somewhat near the origins or the insertions. So for instance, like let's look at one of my favorite self-myofascial release techniques here. This is the pinned stretch is what we call it. And basically what she's going to do is she's going to take a seat, and you notice how she's got this pretty close to like her knee, right? That's because like her hamstring muscles are going to insert right back here. So we're going relatively close to that area. Or maybe she'd press it right about here in the middle of the thigh, because that is where that's where your biceps femoris originates. If we look at it, remember it starts in the middle of the thigh, right about here. So those are the two places she's probably going to press this, or she's going to go right up to the very top of the hamstring, like right back here on the posterior part of the pelvis. So the three main places you're going to place a foam roller are like right around here, or maybe right about here. And that's going to get you close to the tendon, which is where those Golgi tendon organs live. Actually, here's a great example of like places to place this, right? You can see these are all the different trigger points, right? So placing that foam roller on that muscle, and you're going to hold that Golgi tendon organ for about 30 seconds. And what's going to happen is it's going to be a little painful. It's going to freak out a little bit because the Golgi tendon organ thinks that when you put pressure on it, it thinks that there's lots of tension. It thinks that the muscle's being stretched as far as it can stretch, right? Like it thinks that there's massive amounts of tension. It's like, oh no, if we stretch any further, I'm going to tear the muscle, right? So as a protective mechanism, it starts making kind of a deep pain signal so that you will like relax, right? And alleviate that pressure. So the Golgi tendon organ starts to freak out and thinks there's a lot of tension. And meanwhile, the muscle spindle is also starting to freak out. You can even feel sometimes like your muscles are sort of squeezing in response to this pressure, right? But what happens is after a little while, the Golgi tendon organ goes, all right, well, this tension is still here. The safest thing to do is to relax the muscle. So what it will do is it will send a signal over to the muscle spindle, the one that's sensing the length, and it will tell the muscle spindle to fully let go, relax. And if that muscle spindle lets go, all of a sudden you get deeper range of motion, right? So that process is autogenic inhibition, right? We are putting pressure on a Golgi tendon organ, which will inhibit an overactive muscle spindle. And it will tell that muscle spindle basically to just be quiet and relax. Takes about 30 seconds, by the way, sometimes longer. Andres, I'm sure, like I said, you're the massage guy. I'm sure like you've experienced plenty of times where you're like, this freaking thing will not let go. Dalen, you too, right? Both of you guys are massage guys. Like, I'm sure you've both experienced that plenty of times. So that is our autogenic inhibition there. Then we've also got static stretches. Static stretches are where you're just going to take a muscle and you're going to pull it end to end, right? You're going to go through a full range of motion. You're going to hold that range of motion for 30 seconds. That is also going to benefit from autogenic inhibition. So autogenic inhibition, after a long duration, we basically do a big long hold, and that'll apply because you're putting pressure on the Golgi tendon organ by basically stretching it end to end. So there's two ways that you can apply autogenic inhibition. You can either just kind of push on your muscle and like press it, right? So if I have like golfer's elbow, right, this is actually what I would work on, right? I'd press really hard right here, this little tender spot right near my elbow, and that's where this muscle is originating, right? So poke, right? And if I hold it, maybe do a little like wiggle back and forth, trying to kind of break up the adhesions and along the grain of the muscle, right? That is going to, maybe work out that's going to cause that autogenic inhibition, right? My muscle is going to relax. So then this forearm muscle is going to lengthen into its full, length that it's supposed to be in. And now I'm going to have increased range of motion. And with that increased range of motion, I can train my brain then to get used to that range of motion, which will cause those muscles to naturally want to relax into this type of position. So that's going to be doing things for 1 to 2 sets. You want to hold your pressure for about 30 seconds. And you should always be doing the foam rolling first and the stretching second. Always start with the foam rolling, then move into your stretches, because if you do it that way, you are untying the knots, then you're lengthening the knots out, right? So you want to make sure that like it's otherwise like you're just, if it had a knot and you just pulled it in, you might be lengthening some of the fibers, but those knotted parts are just, they're going to hunker down even tighter. So always foam roll first and stretch second. And so that's foam rolling. We've also got, like I said, static stretching. This allows our muscle to relax by creating elongation, right? Pulling the muscle end to end. We definitely want to do this for low levels of force. We do not want to do this for a massive amount of force, right? This should be very, very gentle. And it should be held for a relatively long duration of, 30 seconds, right? Sometimes longer, like I said, 4 minutes in certain types of yoga. But that is also going to apply autogenic inhibition. So if we are, writing down our acute variables, like our rules for how to do this, right? We are going to apply this for 1 to 2 sets. We're going to hold both of them for 30 seconds per repetition. And we will do that like I said, foam rolling first, stretches second. So let's take a look briefly here, and then we'll go through this again later. So let's say I had a client with really tight hip flexors, right? And he's got a really bad sort of excessive lean and a low back arch, right? So he's got tight calves, tight hip flexors, and he's got tight lats, all of those things, right? So his lats are really tight. That's why his back's arching. His hips are really tight. That's why his back's arching. His calves are really tight. That's why he's leaning, and it could also still cause some like back arching. So I foam roll those three things first. I turn his calves off, I turn his hip flexors off, and I turn his lats off, right? Then I'm going to do a static, and I do that for one set, 30 seconds each. And I tell them, like, hold the most tender areas. And then we are going to do a static runner's calf stretch, which is going to look like this. Mute that real quick. So we're going to drive that back into a full range of motion, squeeze the glute, right? And you can see it like drawing a nice straight line here. And that creates like this forward motion stretching out that calf, right? That's creating deeper dorsiflexion. So, this person's really good at plantar flexion. They struggle with their dorsiflexion. So we do static calf stretch. Then we follow that with a kneeling hip flexor stretch, right? So we have them go into like a kneeling position here. And, we drive we're just going to have them drive the body forward, which, this muscle, this is actually, what's ironic is like this hip is now in hip flexion, right? But this one, you can see it's being driven behind her. That's hip extension. So we are stretching out the hip flexors here, right? And then I have them follow that up with a ball lat stretch. And the ball lat stretch is right here. We're just going to pull that, like how they did on the side that we can't see as easily. But that extension of the arm, right, that shoulder, he's performing shoulder flexion, which is going to stretch out that lat muscle right underneath the arms, right? So that is a program that we're going to write to sort of address these overactive muscles in our client. And they're going to do the same thing for their cool down, right? We don't want those muscles to retighten up after the workout is over. So again, a static calf stretch, a static kneeling hip flexor stretch, and a ball lat stretch. Any questions on static stretches so far, guys? All right. So next one we're going to look at is active flexibility, which we're going to have to take a quick break from the PowerPoint. So active flexibility, kind of just going into our notes here, is what we're going to apply to any client who is in level 2. So this is going to be a client who is, in phase 2 or phase 3 or phase 4, right? They're going to get a level 2 version, right? So it doesn't matter if they're, they're calling it muscular development now. Hypertrophy, max strength, or strength endurance. Doesn't matter which phase of training they're in. They are going to be getting like active flexibility, okay? So active flexibility is designed to improve your joint range of motion in a very different way. So this is actually going to do it through repetition and what we call reciprocal inhibition. So we had autogenic inhibition, which is how we improve stuff in corrective flexibility. Active flexibility, we use reciprocal inhibition instead. So what does active flexibility consist of? Well, the tools you've got at your disposal are going to be self-myofascial release again. So we're still going to foam roll, right? We're not removing that. We're going to apply this to every level actually. But instead of following up our foam rolling with static stretches, now we're going to follow up our foam rolling with active isolated stretches. And those are the short duration stretches where we do them for repetitions, right? And so because we are doing them for repetitions, we are actually contracting antagonist muscles, right? So here's the thing. Remember when I mentioned biceps, like this has to relax when I contract this. If I want to stretch out this muscle, what I can do is I can actually contract my tricep. And if I send several signals in a row to my tricep that says contract, then my brain will start sending signals to my antagonist muscle that say relax, right? So let's look at an example of that in like the hamstrings, right? So if I'm just gonna do a standing version because you guys can see it on camera. But if I go like this, right, I'm gonna support myself here, and I contract my quadriceps muscles, right? Like I really contract these muscles in my quad, that's gonna cause my leg to come forward. And that's gonna stretch out my hamstring back here. So when I do that, right, if I go like this, and then I relax and I contract those quads again, and I relax and I contract those quads, right? I'm sending a signal that says contract on one side of the joint, and I'm sending a signal that says relax on the other side of the joint. So that could be what improves my joint range of motion, right? By contracting one muscle, I'm telling the other one to relax. So this is a great way for us to improve our joint range of motion, right? If we've got a client with limited dorsiflexion, right? We can do an exercise like this, which is actually a strength training exercise, where we actually perform resisted dorsiflexion. So they basically tie a resistance band to the toe, and you're going to pull that toe back towards here. And that's going to contract this muscle here on the shin. That's your anterior tibialis. So by contracting your anterior tibialis and strengthening that muscle, that is going to result in us pulling the joint back to its full range of motion. Now, this is a strengthening exercise, make no mistake, but it's still applying this idea of like reciprocal inhibition. Every time you contract a muscle, you should be reciprocally inhibiting the antagonist muscle on the other side of the joint. So this is one of the reasons why we actually don't do this with our youths, is because they don't have very good contractile abilities, right? So because they aren't able to create very strong contractions, active flexibility isn't, you just can't take very good advantage of it. So we usually just skip it with our youth clients, right? And we focus more on just applying static stretches. The other thing is active stretches are 1%, I want to be very clear here, very, very little. They are ever so slightly more risky than static stretches. Static stretches are these gentle, long duration, you're not moving, so your likelihood of, moving through a range of motion that might, sustain an injury is very, very limited. Whereas active, like you are contracting, and so it's possible that you can move through too much range of motion. I've never once seen it in my career, but theoretically there it is. So that's active isolated stretches, right? So we do these little short contractions that stretch out the antagonist muscles. So active flexibility consists of self-myofascial release and active isolated stretches, okay? Short duration stretches where we contract, right? And reciprocal inhibition, by definition, you definitely need to know this definition, is the contraction of an agonist, so the contraction of one muscle, that decreases the neural drive to its antagonist, right? So if this is honestly, like, let's go back to the Batman analogy here. Last time we left our heroes, Batman was tied up by the Joker, and Robin was trying to do too much work and he couldn't keep up with it, right? And now suddenly we are splashing water on Batman's face over and over again. And we're like, wake up, come on, right? Like we do a contraction and we do another contraction, we do another contraction, and we're just slowly trying to get that muscle to wake up, right? So like, if I'm trying to get my quad turned on, I would contract that quad muscle, right? And eventually it's going to get woken up and it's going to tell my hamstring muscle to relax. That's reciprocal inhibition, right? So what we do, the way we apply this, we're going to do 1 to 2 sets. Each repetition, we're going to hold it for about 1 to 2 seconds. So just a little short pause. And we're going to do that for 8 to 10 repetitions, okay? So let's look at our example person that we built earlier, right? Here's our client. We move forward in time. First month we started him out, right? Let's see, this is month 1. Let's say this is like January 1st, right? He was in phase 1. Well, then in phase 2, like which is month 2, right? We moved him into the strength level. So we were applying corrective flexibility here. We're going to apply active flexibility here. He's still got the tight calves, the tight hip flexors, and the tight lats. We know those are his overactive muscles. So we write a program where we still foam roll the calves, hip flexors, and lats. Literally, this is exactly the same in both of these programs. But rather than doing a static calf stretch, a static hip flexor stretch, and a static lat stretch, now we are going to do an active calf stretch, an active hip flexor stretch, and an active lat stretch, right? So let's take a look at what this active, isolated calf stretch looks like, right? So this is going to be a slightly different version, right? Last time, she went into a full range of motion and she just kind of held herself there, right? But this time, she's going to go into that full range of motion and then see her opposite leg here. What she's doing is she's using her leg as a target as she's turning her hips. And what that does is that rotates her calf in the transverse plane like this, which this is taking the stretch off of, like, if she goes here, this is going to apply a deep stretch to that lateral gastrocnemius. And then when she pulls back this way, that's going to cause a relaxation of that lateral gastrocnemius. So now she's contracting her medial gastrocnemius to draw her across this way. And then she's relaxing her medial gastrocnemius for a second to give it a little bit of rest. And then she's turning it back on. So by going back and forth like that, she is applying a contraction. I'll be honest, guys, this is actually my least favorite active calf stretch. I much prefer just taking my client into like a full range of motion like this, and then encouraging them to pull their toes up towards them as they lunge forward, and then relaxing. And then pull your toes up towards you, and then relax. I prefer that version just because there's a little bit less lateral movement, which oftentimes your clients, it's a little bit harder to coach. And also I think that one's a little bit more approachable for people to do at home. So I personally like a different version than the version I actually gave you an example of. But remember, there's different tools out there. You know, there's totally a time where I would find that more appropriate, you know? So we got a lot of different tools out there. And then let's look at the active kneeling hip flexor stretch, right? This is just like what we saw earlier. Remember before, she went into a stretch and she held it for 30 seconds, right? But now she stretches, she goes forward, holds it for 1 to 2 seconds, and relaxes. Now, the thing she needs to be sure that she's doing in order to make this more effective, right? Remember, reciprocal inhibition benefits from the contraction of the opposite muscle. So she should be contracting her glute muscle back here as she's driving her hip forward, right? So she's not just passively moving through this range of motion, she's moving forward and she's contracting the glute on that same side. That is going to send a signal that says contract, you know, from the brain. It's going to go turn this on and it's going to travel down and say turn this off. And then we've got our active ball lat stretch. Okay, so he's doing a foam roller version here, which is also still really good. So she sits back into a stretch, right? She's contracting some other upper back muscles, but that's relaxing. The lat here, she holds it for 1 to 2 seconds, comes out of it, and then stretches right back down, 1 to 2 second hold. So she's active isolated version stretching these, okay? Questions on active stuff, guys? Any comments? All righty. So let's take a look at our power level here. So the power level, functional flexibility, right? Let's say we move all the way up the OPT model. We're at the very top now. We're in level 3 or phase 5. And we are going to drive our client through things that are really designed, you know, this is the power level, right? This is all about like explosive movements, right? So, you know, this is where we are going to apply our category, which is functional flexibility, right? Functional flexibility are going to be dynamic stretches that mimic the movements of everyday life in order to draw your muscles through a complete range of motion. So when you do arm circles, right, that's also sometimes known as a ballistic stretch, but it is also functional. You are contracting muscles to draw you through a full range of motion. And it's a functional flexibility movement for your chest, right? So this is really great if your client's in the power level. They've peaked, right? They're at the very top of the staircase. This is why like their warm-up is really just a couple body weight exercises, right? Honestly, it's kind of like the warm-ups you see in a lot of group exercise classes where it's like, you know, step side to side, do some butt kickers, do some high knees, some knee squeezes, right? Like some rotations, arm circles, all that stuff that you see a lot of times like as a warm-up that kind of gets your blood pumping, right? This is benefiting from the assumption that your client already has good range of motion. So functional flexibility is really not designed to improve your flexibility, at least not in the long run. Although it can give you a little bit of a better range of motion like during the workout because your tissue temperature is going to increase, your body temperature is going to go up a little bit, and that's going to kind of cause everything to expand, right? This requires movement without compensating in all three planes of motion. So if your client can't move through the sagittal, frontal, and transverse planes like effectively, they should not be doing functional flexibility. It's not safe, right? We want to make sure they have a full range of motion. They already have, like, they've progressed through the other two stages of flexibility training. They should have a goodly amount of range of motion by this point. If they don't, you really shouldn't be doing functional flexibility, right? I wouldn't give a client with super rounded shoulders arm circles because they're going to do those arm circles like this instead of being able to move through a full range of motion. It'd be totally inappropriate, right? I should do static stretches with that person until I can get them, you know, back to a full range of motion. So functional flexibility is going to also consist of self-myofascial release. Like, make no mistake about it. We always foam roll, right? So we untie any knots that we can. 1 to 2 seconds, or 1 to 2 sets, 30 seconds each, right? And then we're going to pair that with dynamic stretches. So dynamic stretches go in the functional flexibility category. And what they are, they're functional movements that moves the joint through a full range of motion through multiple planes. Body weight squats, lunge with a twist, even like a step up, right? These are sometimes things that used to be like strength training exercises in previous phases, but now they're warm-up exercises in the power phase. Again, remember, this is the peak, right? This is where like someone is at their most athletic. So what you're going to do is you're going to do, we can see it says 1 set here in your regular book. It should be 1 to 2 sets. So this is actually the number I want you to pay attention to. So 1 to 2 sets, 3 to 10 exercises, and you're going to perform anywhere from 10 to 15 repetitions. So if we go back to our client, right, let's say, you know, he's improved. He did his static stretches for the first month. Second month, he did his active stretches. Third month, he's going to, why is there so much space here? Sorry. Third month, he's going to do a dynamic warm-up. So we're still going to foam roll his calves. We're still going to foam roll his hip flexors, and we're still going to foam roll his lats, just like we have every other month so far. But now he's going to do some functional stretches for those overactive muscles. So this first one's going to be called a heel walk. I've had you guys do these. I know they're a little goofy. They're actually one of my favorite movements. But a heel walk here is going to stretch out his calf muscles while turning on his tibialis muscles. So he's going to rock himself back onto his heels. He's going to take a step forward, and that is creating a stretch in that gastrocnemius. I know it looks goofy, but it is a great warm-up exercise. That's a great way to improve that overall mobility in that calf muscle. We're going to do a walking lunge with a twist, which we can see here, right? Don't have to do this with a dumbbell, by the way, but we lunge and we twist away from the down leg, right? That's going to stretch out that overactive hip flexor that we talked about earlier, while also teaching those muscles how to use his core simultaneously. We're going to do a walking lateral lunge. So So we step out. That's going to stretch out his abductors actually. But what's nice about this is that's still creating like a little bit of extension here. And there are certain adductor muscles that perform like hip flexion. So this one's not a direct correlation to exercises previously, but it does fit really well into this routine. And we needed a couple more exercises to throw in there. We're going to do some butt kickers. I was like waiting for us to get a freaking ad finally. So we're gonna do some butt kickers, right? By the way, she's not doing a terrible job, but like you can see she's definitely turning her feet out. Ideally, and then like this is coming up kind of at an angle here. So she's got a little bit of like internal rotation happening here. Not a huge fan of that. Ideally, we would coach our clients to be straight on with these. But it's not bad. It's not terrible. And that's stretching out the quadricep muscles, and which are, part of those hip flexors. And then we've got arm circles, which is primarily I think of it as a chest exercise, but it's certainly stretching out the lats a little bit, right? This is abduction and extension, right? So that's definitely stretching out the lats as well. We could take that into a much deeper range of motion if we wanted to, right? And then finally, we've got alternating arm raises, which is a great lat stretch, where basically you're just going to kind of go back and forth, and alternate from side to side. And that's going to stretch out that lat muscle. So those are dynamic stretches. What we would do, 10 repetitions each, and maybe do 1 to 2 sets of that, right? So we get 2 sets of 10 reps. Now notice how before we had them jump on the cardio for 5 minutes afterwards, right? In order to like really raise tissue temperature. This stuff will get their heart rate up. This will get their blood pumping. Their tissue temperature will be pretty elevated by time you move through this whole circuit, right? Heel locks, lunge twist, lateral lunge, butt kickers, arm circles, arm raises, back to the top for a second set of everything, right? You're going to be pretty, warm after that. So we can actually skip the cardio warm up in our power phase of training. But you'll notice the cool down are still static stretches, right? And that was true in strength as well. Once the workout's over, we're just going to do static stretches, right? Now, the reason we have different, there might be like a question about like, okay, well, which one of these is best, right? Should I do static stretches? Should I do active? Should I do functional, right? Which one's the best one, right? And that's a lot of times what exercise information kind of gets translated into, like a lot of times your clients are like, what's the best supplement I can take? What's the best diet I can be on, right? They want the pro tips, right? They're like, I'm already doing everything perfectly. So now I need, the best version. It's like, are you doing everything perfectly? So when we're looking at this, right? Don't think of these different techniques as one being better than the other. They are all just slightly different from one another, and they all have different purposes. Static stretches are probably the best at improving your joint range of motion. So if we are talking about like improving mobility, static stretches are probably going to be the way to go. But the problem with static stretches is, remember, they are relying entirely on autogenic inhibition. And autogenic inhibition is all about turning your muscles off. So what that can do is that can lead to a weakness in those muscles temporarily, right? Lasts about half hour, maybe an hour, right? So now all of a sudden, if we do a big long static stretch, we might lose strength in whatever muscle it is we're trying to stretch, which could mean that we don't lift as heavy in the gym, which means that we're not applying the principle of overload very effectively, right? We need the body to be overloaded in order to grow. So then it's like, well, why do we even have static stretches at all then, right? Well, here's the thing. A lot of people will tell you that it is a flat reduction in strength, and that's not necessarily true. It's not that it reduces your strength by, let's say 30%, right? So you would normally be able to lift 100 pounds, you do a bunch of static stretches, then you can only lift 70 pounds, right? That'd be a pretty big reduction. It's not that big, by the way. It's usually only about like 5 to 10% at the most. But it only affects the upper 30% of your 1 rep max. So if you're lifting at 70% of your 1 rep max, or even as low as 50% of your 1 rep max, static stretches really are not going to have a very big effect. So let's say it's a flat 10%. You can lift 100 pounds, you do some static stretches, now suddenly you can only lift 90 pounds, right? So if you were doing 1 rep, you'd only be able to lift 90 pounds, right? Let's say you're doing 2 reps, right? That means that the weight needs to go even a little bit lower, right? The amount that strength is going to diminish is also going to decrease. So by time, so it's going like it affects you by 10% at your 1 rep max. Maybe it affects you by like 9.5% at your 2 rep max. Maybe only 8.5% at your 3 rep max. Maybe it only affects you by 7% at your 6 rep max, right? So it goes down lower and lower and lower the further you get away from your 1 rep max, which means if we're doing like 50 to 70% of your 1 rep max, which is 12 to 20 repetitions, by the way, it doesn't really have any effect at all. So static stretches don't just make you weaker overall, they affect the upper 80 to 70% of your strength. That's how we should be, but that's much longer to say. So people don't say that. They're like, oh, static stretches make you weaker, right? And that's just not accurate. So those are static stretches, right? Now, if I was lifting, like here's the thing, if I were lifting at 85% of my 1 rep max, yeah, I don't want to do static stretches, right? I want to lift heavy. So that's why we have active stretches. Active flexibility has been shown to improve your range of motion, but it doesn't quite do it as well as static stretches, but it doesn't have the effect that static stretches have in inhibiting my muscles. So if it's not inhibiting my muscles as much, then if I'm lifting really heavy, I probably want to do active stretches. And here's what's funny about functional flexibility. It's like, well, what about the range of motion here? This really is not about improving your muscles' range of motion. Functional flexibility honestly turns your muscles on. It's really much more about like contracting certain muscles to get those muscles really turned on so that those muscles can work really, really hard so that they can be very explosive when the time comes to do like your power explosive movements. So it's funny, like corrective flexibility is all about deactivating overactive muscles. Active flexibility is kind of in the middle, and functional flexibility is honestly about activating underactive muscles, but it's really not designed to actually improve your range of motion. It's not really its purpose. Not that it can't happen. It just isn't as good at it as either of these other 2 versions. So that is where you can see like the goals and the physiologic, properties that we're talking about correspond with our levels. Stabilization is all about lifting light and improving your range of motion. Strength is all about improving your strength, right? And power is all about improving explosiveness. So dynamic stretches help with this, active stretches help with this, static stretches help with that. And that is why we want to make sure we apply this. So I want to draw one final little chart for you guys before we summarize everything up. I need a different version of the OPT model. Actually, you know what? I'm going to do this in Excel. This is going to be a little weird, but I think this will work better in Excel, actually. All right. So we got level, and we've got 1, 2, and 3. And then we've got phase. 1. I should have given this more space. Insert. 2, 3, 4, and 5. Flexibility technique. I'm sorry. Corrective flexibility. Active flexibility. Functional flexibility. Okay. Oh, you know what? Should have done this in Word, actually. Don't save. Sorry. I'm drawing a little chart for you guys. And merge and merge. So corrective flexibility is going to be SMR and static stretches. And then we've got active flexibility, which is going to be SMR and active isolated stretches, of course. And then we got functional flexibility, which is also SMR and dynamic stretches. So this is kind of what this should look like, right? It doesn't matter if your client is in phase 2 or 3 or 4. It should always be active flexibility, right? And then these are the tools that are used within each. So you guys are going to need to get familiar with these. NASM will ask you like a variety of things. You need to know that corrective flexibility is applied in level 1, right? And then corrective flexibility is static stretches plus SMR. So don't make the mistake of saying, like, you know, if you see a NASM question that says, which of the following types of flexibility would be most appropriate for a client in stabilization, don't say static stretches. A type of flexibility is corrective, active, or functional, right? A tool within that category is static stretches. I don't think you'll get questions like that, but you could get questions like that. So we want to be prepared for it. Same thing is true of clients in level 3, right? You could get functional flexibility as the category. The tools within that category are foam rolling and dynamic stretches. So hopefully that visual helped a little bit. All right, let's go ahead and summarize everything up. So flexibility training, we're going to take advantage of the ability to grow at a young age. We're going to take advantage of the fact that, like, you know, they can experience growth at a really exponential rate. So get used to your flexibility training when you're young, and that can teach you lifelong habits to follow as you get older. Good flexibility involves maintaining a full range of motion of your joints. You don't need hyper range of motion of your joints, but want to have full range of motion. It's going to reduce your risk of injury, and it's going to improve your sports performance, right? This is going to make you, you know, perform better because you'll be able to move through a full range of motion. So poor flexibility is obviously bad because it alters our movement patterns, it alters our range of motion, and causes relative flexibility, which often results in an overuse injury. I mean, let's take a look, like that girl that was doing the butt kickers. The reason I don't like the rotation that she's doing is because that causes too much rubbing on the lateral condyles of the knee. And so that can cause like a rubbing sensation that could lead to like runner's knee, right? Or runner's hip. Sometimes called IT band syndrome. So like that's relative flexibility. We want to make sure we move through the correct range of motion. And assessments can help us identify what those compensations are. Corrective flexibility is great for improving movement compensations, range of motion, and muscle imbalances. It consists of SMR and static stretches. Functional flexibility is really great for improving explosiveness before athletic activities. You need to make sure that you can move through all 3 planes of motion effectively. But these are movements that basically mimic everyday life: squats, lunges, hinges, presses, things like that. And that is SMR and dynamic stretches. So that is everything. Do you guys, I know some of you guys, this should sound pretty familiar, right? Like I said, the program design classes are all meant to feel a little familiar, but hopefully this is starting to solidify a little bit more, get a little more familiar with it, starting to feel really confident about your own ability to kind of design your own flexibility routines and put those things together. I know we haven't necessarily taught which exercises go with which movement patterns very much. I mean, we've talked about it here and there. I've given brief examples really quickly. But that is, you know, we're going to be going over those over the next 2 mods. We'll be looking at that in kinesiology, and we'll be looking at that in Assessments 101. So, but hopefully you're starting to get a little more comfortable. If I told you, hey, you got a client in level 1, you should be able to pick out a couple static stretches that you think would be good before them. If I told you had a client in level 2, you know where your active isolated stretches are in your textbooks and stuff. Questions today, guys. That's about all I got for you. Andres, Cody, Dalen, you guys feeling good? Do you have any questions today?
No, sir. That was the only homework though, correct?
There is homework, yeah. Homework 2 today. I was like, there's 4. It's day 4, homework 2. My brain. So yeah, knock that out for me today if you can. You will also find on Canvas, actually, I'll take us to Canvas here real quick. You'll find on Canvas that there's a downloadable version of the sort of 3-month routine that I put together today. I am just realized that screen share is off. You'll find day 4, chapter 5 here. If you go to it, there's the guidelines. There's the PowerPoint. There's the notes. I'm sorry. There's the PowerPoint. There's the booklet. There's the notes. And then here is the little template that I built. This little 3-month example right here. So you guys can download that in case you want to kind of take yourself through it. It's got hyperlinks that take you to example versions of all those stretches. And then there's a hard copy of homework 2. And then there's the actual link and stuff. So lots of little links to look at today, but it should be pretty easy to navigate. All right, guys. If you don't got anything for me, I don't got anything for you. I'm gonna let you all out of here. And I'll see you guys tomorrow.